who are these like really rich people. And they're big corporate people, many of whom have learning disabilities, and have figured out ways of compensating and dealing with it and overcoming the challenge in ways that are just wonderful. It's just really wonderful dealing with them. But this young man, who was an expert cartoonist, was asked one question. What was it like being a student with learning disabilities, K-12? Now, I ask you, no matter what your professions are, if you're paid professionals or unpaid professionals, as one of the colleagues yesterday called herself, what would you predict would be the achievement level of this student? Seriously low, right? I mean, you have to have such internal fortitude to overcome that kind of perspective that people are giving you. And that's another thing that drives me forward, is thinking about kiddos like this everywhere. I worked for a couple of years after I left state government with a guy named StevanKukic. And I warned people yesterday, and I'll warn you today during this keynote, that once you work for Steven, you become a lovey-dovey, covey sort of person. And how many of you know about the 7 or 8 habits of highly effective people? Good. Time magazine said that he was one of the 25 most influential Americans of the 20th century. And it's true. And he's still very influential in the 21st century. In fact, what I say to people is that if you're smart, one of the things you'll do is bring out your 7 Habits book and your 8th Habit book and your Principle-Centered Leadership book and your Speed of Trust book. And what you'll do is bring that forward and use it as a part of what you're doing in the RTI revolution. Because one part of the RTI revolution is making sure that the school is a collaborative unit of people moving forward. It's a place where people feel comfortable taking risks because of the level of trust that exists within the school. There's a measure of that, by the way. The measure is that the way Covey talks about it is, he says it's easy to be loyal to people who are in front of you. The test is, are you loyal to the absent? Now just think about that where you work for a moment. Let's go to a faculty room. 4 teachers have gathered for a moment to talk just during the busy day. And they're talking about whatever they're talking about. One teacher leaves. What is the very first sentence said by the 3 who are left? If it's continuing the conversation, then that's saying something about the level of trust that exists. What happens too often is that this is what the 3 say. Can you imagine that she wore that particular blouse to work today? She's got these big things, and when she bends down, the kids see all of it. Can you imagine she'd do that? And then they go back to the conversation, and everyone giggles, and then you go on, right? But what if the 3 people taught themselves when they make that comment about their colleague? Don't leave the room. Because when you leave the room, people talk about you. So I think this idea of what Covey's talked about and what he's gathered together, I think, really makes some sense. When I was working for him, he said that these are the 3 constants in life. I'll use this as a structure for what we'll talk about during the keynote. The first constant is change. Isn't that weird? That may be the only constant that exists, right? How many of you would agree that change is a constant? How many of you would agree that you wish that change was a constant for everyone other than yourself? Yeah, so that's a dilemma I think we face. But that's true, that change is a constant. Now, Covey says the only defense you have to an ever-changing world is to have a never-changing set of principles that direct what you do. Not guide what you do, but direct what you do. I challenged the folks in the pre-conference workshops yesterday to think about this, and I want everyone to think about this here in the room and across Canada who are listening and watching. I want you to think about the principles that you have as professionals, paid or unpaid, that direct your practice, that you will not violate. What are they? Don't raise your hands or not about this, but the symbol of that in Covey land is to build a personal mission statement. Because a personal mission statement does reflect the principles that you care about the very most. So do you have a personal mission statement that directs what you do, not guides what you do, but directs what you do? So that's the second. The third constant is called choice, and this is where Stephen Covey sounds like my mother. I'm glad to have my mom and dad still on this planet. They're 87 and 84, and they're just a kick. They're just really fun as they're getting older and older. And my mom graduated from high school with a emphasis on her high school diploma in systematic guilt induction. Do you know moms like this? Yeah, I'm Serbian by background, so if there are Jewish people in the room, if you think that you're the only kind of ethnic culture that has moms who know how to instill guilt, Serbian moms know how to do it beautifully. She says guilt is the gift that keeps on giving. So what my mom always says to me is, she says, Steven, you always have a choice. And I said, Mom, no, I was forced into this corner, and I had to make the decision. She said, no, that's not true. You don't ever have to make any decision. It's exactly what that dang StevanKukic said to me. You may not be able to control what's happening to you, but you always have control about your response to what is happening to you. So think about that as a constant. How many of you people in the room have said today, he makes me so mad? Don't raise your hands, because you might be sitting next to the person who's making you mad. When you say that, think about how much power you give up. That person not only has done something nasty to you, but that person has the power to make you mad. That's the point that Covey's making. We have a choice to make, always. So let's talk about this issue of change first. Judy Elliott, one of the generals of the RTI Revolutionary Army, says, change is really good. Why don't you go first? One of the dilemmas in the RTI revolution is that there are a lot of people who are kind of pulling their punch, who are waiting. And in the United States, as you know, that is so driven by lawsuits and so driven by prescriptive law, unlike Canada not having those kinds of federal laws. There's a lot of people in the United States who are waiting to see where the lawsuits will land on RTI before they'll move in that direction. In Canada, what I noticed is happening is, in the places I've worked in Canada, is that there's a lot of people waiting to see what will happen, because this way of dealing with kids violates the paradigm they have about the way kids should be dealt with. Now, they are good professionals, and they're trying to like hesitate a little bit and keep their eye on it, because, geez, what if that works? And how am I going to deal with it if it works, is the question. So excuse me, I think there's a lot of people who believe that change is good and that you should go first. I agree with that point. This was my mentor at UCLA when I went to school there. As I have to mention this every time I present to anyone, I did not go to the University of Spoiled Children in Southern California. This University of Southern California is what it's really called, but it's the University of Spoiled Children from my point of view. I went to UCLA. We were sitting in the bar a couple nights ago, Jackie Wheeler and I, and we were watching the game between Montreal and Pittsburgh. And we were sitting at a table. There were two guys sitting at a bar, and then there's the TV screen. And Sidney Crosby did something really wonderful, and I thought that I could say something about that because he is like Canadian. So I said, yay, way to go, Sidney. And they turned around and looked at me like, are you kidding? Well, that was an intriguing experience. But my experience at UCLA was a wonderful one, and I got to know this grand person who's a real expert in learning disabilities, Barbara Keogh. She yelled at me about making decisions on the basis of research when I was her student. So 20 years after that, she gets this award from the Council for Exceptional Children, which is an international organization that includes Canada, for a lifetime of research. And I'm sitting in the front of 5,000 people, and she says this. I almost stood up and yelled at her because she had yelled at me so much. By that time, it was Barbara and Steve rather than Dr. Keogh, my Lord and Savior, is the way I dealt with her back then. But this is the issue, I think, that we have, is that a lot of policies are made based on values that people have, not based on research. In fact, this concept of including kids with disabilities is one that you would think would maybe be based on research, but it isn't. It's based on the fact that for too many years in too many places, kids with disabilities were shunted off too often to segregated settings, to separate classrooms, to separate schools, when some of them could have really benefited from being back in their neighborhoods. So those values have changed, and thank God they've changed, When Jackie and I were walking in today with our Starbucks coffee and rolling bags and all that stuff, and then there was a little button to push on a door, so the door opened automatically. That happens because of changes in values, and I think it's wonderful that it has. But then we've got to use research to really tell us how to implement those value-laden policies. That's the point. Well, this teacher dealt with the issue of an ever-changing world in an interesting way. It says she started dressing this way when she found out that society values Madonna $60 million more a year than teachers. So she thought she'd get more respect from her students if she dressed like Madonna. See, it's just like a... Don't you love her? Look at the kids' faces, too. I love the kids' faces in this. It's fishnet stocking, spiked heels. But she still has her little cameo on right there over her sweater, which I think is kind of a cool thing. All right, anyway, let's go on to the second constant. The second constant is this issue of principles. Here is a principle I'd like you to read 3 times. Some of you will like it and some of you won't, depending on where you work and what you're doing. But it's really true, isn't it? Every organization is perfectly aligned for the results it gets. Now, I am addicted to politics, and that's sort of one of those things that happens for people who are citizens of the United States. You get addicted to politics. And I remember when our last president was president, and what happened to the perspective that people had about the United States in the rest of the world. It was very predictable, because what the Bush administration said was, by the way, we're in charge, we're the father, and you're either going to be with us in our family, or if you're against us, you're part of the evil empire. You get it? So make your choice. What was the effect in Canada? What was the effect in Great Britain? What was the effect in the Middle East? Predictable. I'm not trying to make a political statement here. I'm just trying to say that that was predictable. Now you have a different president in the United States, right? I mean, he gets a Nobel, well, I would say thank God too, but that's an aside. He gets a Nobel Peace Prize before he's through being president. Did you see that? A little different? The perspective that people have is very predictable about the United States based on this leadership versus the last. And that's true of every organization as well. Choices are made by organizations, and they have very predictable results. Now, this is even worse about the truth part 2 as a principle. Because that's really true also, isn't it? How many of you have heard of the Myers-Briggs? Raise your hands if you know that thing. The Myers-Briggs is a personality, a kind of an inventory that tells you how you solve problems. I am part of only 10% of people who have ever taken the Myers-Briggs. I'm the most extroverted person that I know. I make decisions based on what my heart says, not what data says, and I force myself to get back to data. That's my paradigm problem. If my heart says move, I want to move. So I've got to remind myself to look at the data also. I want things done now. Now, the effect of that in terms of my leadership is very predictable. People have a tendency to give up trying to fight me, because I am the most verbal person I know, and I have more energy than anybody in this room or anybody watching. I promise you. And that's not always a strength, because I can overcome you. I can overwhelm you. I can overwhelm you to the place where you just say, please, if I agree with you, you leave the room. So I understand that about myself. I understand that my greatest strength is my greatest weakness. But you've got to come to that place, because that's the truth about what we'll do together. So if we're going to build a collaborative culture, all of us have to be sort of that self-introspective about the way we act and what we can do well and what we can do that isn't so useful. This is the greatest piece of wisdom that Stephen has given the world, and it's not one of his habits. I shared this briefly yesterday with the group, but I did want you to see this here for this keynote. It says the way you see the world determines what you do, and that determines what you get. So consistent with Ron Edmonds' idea, we do have a choice about whether we'll be successful with kids, right? Because of the way we see the world. And that predicts what we do, and that predicts what we get. Now, here's the Covey model. It's called the maturity continuum. It is so interesting to me that the literature on RTI, the literature on professional learning communities, the literature coming from great people like Robert Marzano and others, are all coming to the same conclusion. And then I recently read this wonderful book called All Systems Go by Michael Fullan, the great Canadian who knows more than anybody in the world about educational systems change. And they're all coming to the same conclusion. We've got to build an interdependent unit in each school if we're going to have success. We've got to build collective capacity. And the only way to do that is to have interdependence. Covey says that that's the goal in life. The goal is not independence. We all start off being